On this week's Live with Littlewood, is the watering down of Freedom Day already underway? How much will really change on the 19th of July? How many restrictions will end up as permanent rather than temporary as promised? And with President Macron floating mandatory vaccination as an idea in France and the Delta variant spreading in the US, how well are other nations handling the pandemic? And once we've finally conquered COVID, as much as we will ever do, we know it's only a matter of time before some other crisis will hit us. What threats to humanity lurk around the corner? All that and more coming up on this week's Live with Littlewood. Boom shakalaka, welcome to the last episode in this season of Live with Littlewood. Thank you for joining me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for a free market look at the big issues of the week before we break for the summer. As you can see, I'm in patriotic mood today, still pumped by our heroic 1-1 draw with Italy on Sunday, or more likely still in denial. Coming up on this week's show, beyond looking at England, we'll do a whistle-stop tour right across the world to explore the state of play in tackling the pandemic in other nations. Has some that resisted full lockdowns actually done comparatively well? And will President Macron really force the French people to get the jab? And we'll gaze into our crystal ball and ask what crises should we worry about next? Can we dodge them or mitigate them, and at what cost? It's just 5 days now until July the 19th. Monday, the coming Monday, was meant to mark the return of our ancient freedoms, already postponed from June the 21st. But over the last week, the government's attitude appears to be changing. Although all legal restrictions on social distancing will be lifted, we are seeing the government issue plenty of advice, urging individuals to behave in a certain way and expecting businesses to enforce that behaviour. Not only that, but the Prime Minister has refused to rule out the possibility that some restrictions may have to return in the event of another wave of infections or a new variant of the virus. Is more government dithering the last thing we need? We're calling this first section Reversing the Irreversible, and we're asking what will really change after July the 19th and whether ministers are preparing the ground for a reintroduction of lockdown measures later this year. And joining me to navigate our way through this is my first cousin and science editor of the Times, Tom Whipple. Tom, how are you? Good evening to you, sir.
I'm very good. I come with a childcare crisis, which means that you will hear he's quite loud and he's singing. He's as yet not crying, which is a bonus. But if you hear the background noise, that's that, not me.
I mean, it's a perfect encapsulation of all the problems of lockdown, Tom. Exactly. I mean, I'm glad we're broadcasting them live to a nation just to show all of the problems associated. And I'm also joined by reaction contributor and commentator, Tim Montgomerie. How are you, Tim?
I'm very well, Mark. I don't know whether everyone can see it, but Mark, I'm especially proud to have it in front of you. But behind me, the painting, which Adam Baltimore's Sky thought was a Battle of Waterloo scene, actually is people going through the September grey skies to attend the Theatre of Dreams, Old Trafford, which, of course, Southampton probably do regard as a place similar to Waterloo in many respects. But yeah, that's the setting, especially chosen for you, despite your patriotic garb, which
Thank you, Tim. I think, if I recall rightly, our last trip to Old Trafford for Southampton ended in a very narrow 9-0 defeat for the Saints, if I recall. So thanks for rubbing that in. You're a gentleman, sir, and I always forgive you, therefore, for being a Man United fan. Actually, Tom's a gentleman, but I can't forgive him for not being a fan of football at all. But
more
being
serious offence.
Absolutely a terrible offence. Now, Tim, let me start with you. What are we seeing here? Because this was all supposed to be slow but irreversible. We missed that last date in June where everything was supposed to end, pushed back to July. It doesn't now just look slow, it looks very slow. And I'm not quite sure about the irreversibility part of it either. Are we ever going to get out of this? What's your read of the situation?
Well, perhaps I could take one step back and say what I think is my fundamental assessment of the government that we have currently leading this country. And I think it's a government that's afraid of public opinion, or a government that's certainly in tow to public opinion. And so I think a couple of weeks ago, we had Sajid Javid, a friend of mine for 30 years. I was at university with him, who became the new health secretary. And actually, I think to the surprise of me, the surprise of many people, took quite a gung-ho. I'm just noticing you're lighting up or something here. It's not my average interview experience on...
We're very libertarian at the IA, Tim. You've known that for years.
I do.
I'm drinking, I'm lighting up. Yeah, sorry, don't lose your train of thought.
I don't know why you have me on, given your libertarian leanings, but you're obviously a very tolerant organisation. But Sajid Javid launched a very sort of gung-ho approach to liberalisation, and I think it was partly because instinctively, despite what I've just said about Boris Johnson's current enslavement to public opinion, he's a libertarian at heart. But I think they were genuinely surprised at the polling and some of the pushback from medical experts and others who said that actually we want masks, we want these continuing protections. And I think it's one of the stories of this pandemic is that public opinion has consistently supported the most restrictive measures, which I was sort of sympathetic towards at the early stages of this crisis, when we didn't know whether we were dealing with the bubonic plague or something less sinister. But the remarkable thing about public opinion is how resistance to any kind of liberalisation has persisted. And I'm not a libertarian, as I've just joked with you, Mark, but even me, the sort of deeply sort of socially conservative person, worries really at how easily cowed that makes the British, how easily cowable, if that's a word, that makes the British people, how easily they could be coerced by a government with an authoritarian agenda. We simply don't seem to have a rounded assessment of risk that you need to have in a grown-up society. So you can blame the government for not leading public opinion, and I do blame the government for not leading public opinion, but actually the deeper problem we have as people who believe in a free society is that I'm not sure how much our society wants to be free.
Well, what's your take on this? You have to explain complex scientific matters to readers of the Times on a daily basis. Is Tim right that any sort of reasonably balanced mathematical health assessment of risk has gone out of the window?
I don't think so. I mean, our chief problem is and remains the existence of a self-replicating piece of genetic material in a protein shell. And that is still the case. And, we are opening up. There is genuine concern about unfortunately, this variant, which I shouldn't have let in. My God, my son has discovered how to pick up a shelf and drop it. If it crashes, that's that. I had to run to get the wheels on the bus, which he was pushing earlier. But there is genuine concern about this Delta variant, which is just screwed everything up, basically. It's completely changed the calculus. I'm just going to go into a different room if he's going to be crashing this shelf. We can leave my son to whatever terror.
Well, it's evident your son's going stir crazy. He's not. He's not with the majority that don't want to open up. He's going out of his poor mind. He's destroying your house. So furious is he that he can't practice his normal ancient freedoms, right?
Now in a second,
are we sure that this is Tom's son, not his wife? Are we absolutely sure that this is Tom's son, not his wife? Do we have?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, she was singing the wheels on the bus earlier as well. I think that the issue with masks is that we are going for quite a non sort of cozy strategy at the moment, which is we're basically going for herd immunity by infection of children because we've decided not to vaccinate children, and this is the only way we're going to do it. But the worry is the wave will just get too big, and it is continuing to grow at a quite alarming rate. And we are pushing the modelling, which is actually getting pretty close to what's going on at the moment, is looking like, there are scenarios within it in which the NHS will be tipped to the edge. And slowing it down so that we hit herd immunity but don't just hugely overshoot herd immunity seems to be a relatively sensible thing to do. And if wearing a bit of cloth on your face that has weirdly become totemic does that, then and frankly I don't think it will actually. I don't think it'll make that much difference, but if it does, then it doesn't seem to be like a small an unreasonable price to pay.
But Tom, just so I'm clear with that, are you advising now what the Prime Minister seemed to be advising a few months ago? We've got to take it slow, but it will be irreversible. So you're sort of saying, all right, maybe some, mask wearing or a little bit, no full football stadia for another 5 weeks. Nightclubs only need to have, maximum 500 people. But come to, the 1st of September, it's definitely all done. It's definitely all over. All of the restrictions are repealed. Is that where you're coming from, Tom?
If I was dictator of Britain, I would reverse slightly on the restrictions, vaccinate down to 12-year-olds, hit herd immunity that way, and then open up. I recognise that's not politically tenable. So what we're doing isn't so delaying longer and not vaccinating children is mad. It serves no purpose. If you're going to delay longer, you've got to vaccinate children. Given we're not doing that, this isn't unreasonable. But equally, if we are doing this, this is actually the point at which finally we can squash that sombrero that Boris Johnson spoke about 18 months ago, and the strategy of just controlling the wave rather than suppressing the wave now does make quite reasonable sense. And frankly, we're so close to things that if by saying, work from home if you can, wear a mask, and basically take quite sensible precautions that don't really impede on our freedom is the way to do it, then why not?
Tim, why don't you, have a swipe at libertarians like me as well? Have I really got anything to complain about? By and large now, I'm able to go about my life as normal, I suppose I could say. I mean, there are some irritations. I don't like wearing a mask particularly, but it's not the worst infringement on my life ever. I'm able to go to football matches again. I'm able to go out to restaurants and down the pub. Are we lovers of freedom just sort of whinging a bit too much, do you think?
I think actually the settlement we largely have now is a pretty good one. And actually on one specific area, I wouldn't go as far as the government has gone. And I think the pushback from people like Sadiq Khan and Nicola Sturgeon is actually fair. You and I, Tom, we can choose to go to a restaurant or a pub and, be in a relatively free environment. I think that's one thing. But actually, I think, particularly vulnerable people who've, the 3.5 million people who've been advised to self-isolate, etc., over the last year and a half, they can't necessarily choose whether or not to use public transport to get to work, to get to see family, get to a medical appointment. And so actually, I think retaining some sort of mandatory requirement to wear masks on public transport seems to me to be a legitimate...
in perpetuity, just to be clear, Tim? Or...
Not in perpetuity. But one question I would ask Tom, and this is a genuine question, it's not a question with an agenda, is... At some point, there will be another wave in some form of this virus. Is it not better to sort of release it now, to experience that wave now, rather than delay it for much longer in the winter months when the consequences could be greater? So in a sense, the expectation that we will have a rise of infection at the moment is actually quite a sensible way, because there's more ability to manage it now than it would be if we let off the brakes in a few months, when the potential public exasperation at the restrictions is greater. And maybe one other question, if I'm not usurping your role, Mark.
No, that's right. I'm happy just drinking and smoking here, Tim. You go for it. Yeah.
You didn't send the lager so that I could have a lager here as well. So, but my other question, I'm sort of slightly disappointed at what you said, Tom, but maybe there's a scientific basis for it. I don't really want the vaccination of children who aren't particularly vulnerable in Britain at the moment, when so much of the world isn't vaccinated at all. In terms of priorities, I would have thought it would be a better thing if Britain was shipping some of the vaccinations we have to somewhere like India, because the thing I'm more worried about is not whether our children are vaccinated, but whether the next variant of this, as Tom describes it, a particularly cunning opponent, comes back to bite us and starts to undermine the vaccine. So 2 questions, if you don't mind, Tom. And it's lovely to be on Zoom with my former Times colleague.
Yeah, likewise. No, I'll take them in reverse order. I completely agree on children. If I was world dictator rather than Britain dictator, and I was maximising the utilitarian benefit of the resources we had, then I would have stopped, long ago in Britain. I wouldn't have been vaccinating the 30-year-olds or the 40-year-olds either. Quite clearly, this is not a rational strategy for global happiness, but purely on the basis of how do we stop the pandemic in Britain, there are 2 choices. You vaccinate children or you infect children because of the level of herd immunity. Regarding the infection.
I think Tom's son might now have just grabbed and smashed his iPad, or he didn't want to answer that particular question. It's the problem with Tom, you see, Tim, that these people who come across as very progressive and moderate. 5 minutes ago, he was speculating on what he'd do if he was British dictator. A mere number of minutes had lapsed before he was speculating what he'd do if he was world dictator. We'll try and get Tom back on shortly.
Well, I have red wine now. Just to completely bring the conversation down to a very low level, if I was world dictator or British dictator, my main problem at the moment is going into hotels and not being able to tell the difference between shower gel and shampoo. Why is the writing on all of these things so small? I would, first requirement, make it really large. And by any political party, I'd vote Labour.
Well, Tim, it seems that you would at least be a relatively benign or trivial world dictator. Tom, I was just saying when we lost you for a moment there that you've got to be careful of these supposed progressive, moderate centrists like Whipple. Because 5 minutes ago, he was speculating on what he'd do if he was Britain's dictator. Mere seconds later, he's speculating on what he's going to do when he's world dictator. But my worry here is I now am finding it harder and harder to see an exit. I can see all these hypotheses. Another variant might come along, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, we're only on the Delta variant. I don't know how many letters there are in the Greek alphabet, but there's plenty more variants to come, I guess. But if we're starting to say we're going to have lockdowns because the NHS is in crisis, well, I mean, the NHS is always in crisis, from what I can gather, or it seems to be in crisis half the time. That's just not going to be good enough, is it, Tom? I mean, the solution here is to change the NHS, not to lock down the economy forevermore.
I mean, I've been on this show and you've asked me when I think it would be over, and I think I've always chosen a date 6 months hence, and would continue to do that. I think the issue is we're all expecting a VE day, a freedom day for the pandemic, and in reality, it's a slow fade. And it is a slow fade. Think about where we are now compared to where we were 3 months ago. A lockdown is, there are circumstances one could hypothesize where there would be a lockdown in the winter, but you've got to say they're very, very unlikely. What they're now talking about, I just listened to the Academy of Medical Sciences report today, and what they're talking about is ways to manage coronavirus surge alongside the flu, and they're not talking about lockdowns, which they were talking about last summer. So no, I share your frustration. I assure you, people think that science and science journalism has enjoyed its time in the sun. I would very much like to not be writing about a virus quite soon.
And we've got to crack this because you're just getting bored in your journalistic career, right? I mean, what more priority could there be?
But
we cover the big issues here. What Tom wants to write about, and Tim's frustration with the labelling of shower gel in hotels he visits. Nobody can say we duck the big issues on Live with Littlewood, right?
I share Tim's concerns about shower gel, and in fact, hotel showers in general for the complexity of the controls.
Absolutely. We really are tackling the big issues tonight. Tom, we should form a political party together. Just a question of who leads it, me or you.
But we've got to put a stop to that. I've got a suggestion on who should lead it, and it's our next guest. Joanna Williams is joining us, the founder of the think tank Keo. And I want to move specifically, gents and Joanna, when she's with us, onto this mask question. Because I'm getting more and more, I've become more and more confused about the rules. Good evening, Joanna. Lovely to have you with us. How are you keeping?
Hi, great to be with you as always. Thank you.
So on the mask thing, I can't get my head around what the rules are from July the 19th. And we've got into a position where the government's giving advice here. And I'm always nervous about advice. I'm like, going to pick a lane. Either tell me I've got to do it or tell me it's totally at my own discretion. Advice, and then we'll see whether you follow the advice. And Tim, earlier you were saying that the government seems to be, you might say this is a good thing in a democracy, at the mercy of public opinion, but looks at all of the opinion polls. Polling by Ipsos Mori just last week showed that 64% of people want compulsory mask wearing to continue until COVID is being brought under control worldwide. They want us still to wear masks in our local Morrisons or Asda because there's a problem in Indonesia. Joanna, what's your make of it? I've always despaired of politicians. I'm starting to despair of the British public.
Well, absolutely. I mean, surveys like that are incredibly depressing. I think the same survey showed that people would like there to be a 10:30 p.m. curfew pretty much in place indefinitely as well. And you've got to begin to think, why is freedom as a value so underrated that people would far rather have a prime minister, most of whom the people certainly on Twitter seem to hate, at the same time as hating him, are begging him to impose more restrictions upon us. And that's quite a difficult conundrum to properly get your head around and understand. I mean, I'm critical of Boris Johnson as much as anyone, and it's precisely because I'm very critical of him that, thank you very much, I'd rather he wasn't making rules and imposing restrictions on my life down to what I should wear and what time I should come home, if you don't mind.
Tim, you were speculating about setting up a kind of new party. You haven't worked out the leadership of it yet. Your right-wing social conservative party might do pretty well. As Joanna was saying, 20% of people want a permanent 10 p.m. curfew. 26% want casinos and nightclubs shut in perpetuity. You've certainly got a base of support here, my friend.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not as socially conservative relative to the British population as I thought I was. Yeah. Well, look, I think it's probably the biggest takeaway. That's why I began with it. It's the biggest takeaway I would take from this whole experience, actually. And if I was a dictator in Beijing at the moment, wondering how to frighten the West and the British people, manufacturing some sort of viral threat of some kind would be a very good way of scaring us all to death, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. I live in Salisbury. A little way down the road is Porton Down, which is the British state's laboratory for fighting these threats. And I would be giving it a lot of extra resources at the moment because we don't know whether we've been the victim of a lab leak or something that was done in one of these horrible wet markets that exist in China. But what we do know is that a virus has frightened us more than almost anything else that has happened in the post-war period. And frankly, the death rate at the moment, I hope Tom will confirm it, the death rate in Britain at the moment is lower than the average that it would be at this time. Our ability to be frightened by something which actually isn't anywhere near as big a foe as it could be worries me a great deal. And bizarrely, Mark, I'm almost in the same corner as you on this issue.
Welcome back to the libertarian camp, Tim.
Well, I think maybe you've come halfway as well. But but actually, seriously, the growth of the state, the willingness for us to surrender our freedoms, to defend ourselves from a danger which actually isn't as anywhere near as dangerous as a potential danger could be, is a big issue. And lots of inquiries will need to be held, I think, after this is over. But one of the inquiries I'd love to see, and it's certainly within the power of the government to mandate it, is for the BBC, the public service broadcaster, to actually examine its role in whether it's informed the British public adequately. And so, I think when a death rate is said 50 people died today or 59 people died, I don't think the average British person, and I include myself in this, knows what that means as a percentage of the average daily death rate. And we need a whole new approach to numeracy. Tom is a very numerate journalist, but he's an exception. How many of our journalists in this country actually put the data that they process in any context which actually informs the public? And I'm afraid the BBC, which supposedly is a public service broadcaster, hasn't done much of a public service.
Tom, we're relying on you guys at the Times to do a public service, but I did read an article in the Telegraph a week or so ago saying, I think I've got this right, and if I have got it wrong, I haven't got it wrong by a magnitude or a factor, that flu and pneumonia are now killing 10 times as many people as COVID-19. Have we got now into this sort of trap that for a man with a hammer, every problem's a nail? That there's a focus in people's minds and through the media on this one horrific illness. But if you looked at it, as Tim said, numerically in the round on aggregate, we have an extraordinary overreaction to deal with this one particular nasty disease or illness, which we seem to sort of shrug our shoulders about. I don't know, pneumonia or in the winter hypothermia or anything else. Stuff happens, and I just don't see us getting off that hook. A death from COVID-19 just seems to have, if you like, more value attached to it than a death through any other illness.
I think if I can come back.
Let me bring in Tom, because and then I'll bring you back in, Joanna. Tom.
I mean, to an extent, the issue, the end goal of this is a COVID-19 death is as unremarkable as a flu death. The issue has never really been the present number of deaths. It's more been the potential for what that can become. So, of course, what we're seeing now is the infection rate a month ago. And this is still has a potential to grow exponentially. I mean, thankfully, at the moment, it's growing so that it's 1 in 1,000 reported cases ends up becoming a death now, compared to I think it was about 1 in 100, but before the vaccines, which is absolutely fabulous. And that's why hopefully the summer wave certainly isn't going to be as much of an issue at all in terms of deaths, although hospitalizations are slightly different. But it's always been the potential. It's always been about the potential, and we've seen what that potential has become. It's become 128,000 deaths compared to a normal flu year being about 20,000, and that was with enough restrictions that we completely destroyed flu this year.
No, sure, but Tom, what I'm trying to work out is now. I mean, I'm sort of arguing about the here and now, not who got what right and wrong at various stages, which, as Tim says, there'll be a full sort of public inquiry about and endless private inquiries about. Now, it is a bit like flu, right? I mean, it is true that if we all run around and hug and kiss each other and go to nightclubs, it will spread, and some people will get sick and some people will die. But in terms of trying to communicate to the British people what the kind of level of risk is, now, thanks to vaccination and efficient rollout, we're somewhere around that kind of level. Whereas what Tim was implying was people still think that we're facing the apocalypse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've never been personally at all afraid of COVID, and maybe that's because I read all of the stuff. But I know I'm not at risk. This has always been about a societal risk for me, and I think there certainly are people who are afraid. But I think there are a lot of people who got that this is something we're doing as a collective for a collective problem, and it remains a collective problem insofar as there are about 500 hospitalizations a day, and on current trends, that's definitely going to hit 1,000 and probably 2,000. And there's the potential for it to go higher. And that's what we're talking about. But, we're doing this amidst the situation where we can basically do everything we want. It's not like the winter, and it's a question of what's proportionate. But, when you've got an exponentially growing infectious disease, it does become all dominating because it'll dominate all those other diseases. One of the weirdest things about this whole pandemic is this idea that we have ignored cancer or something, and that cancer's been worse because of COVID. Well, absolutely the worst thing for cancer is to have all of your beds occupied by COVID patients, and that's why we haven't treated it as well as we should have. So that's why it becomes all-consuming. But look, this should, in the next 6 months, probably in the next 3 months, it should transition from being something that should be all-dominating to all of us to still the worst public health crisis problem at the moment, but you can have a really bad public health problem that hopefully can be dealt with by public health, and that's what we need to get to.
Joanna, what's your take? Am I right that we've, you can agree that COVID is serious and it's been unbelievably grim, but we've exaggerated this particular threat out of proportion with, all of the threats on day-to-day life that we have?
Well, I think that's certainly true. And just the fact that we have statistics reported to us, we can, all of us, I'm sure, cite every single day how many people died in the past 24 hours within 28 days of a COVID test. I couldn't, hand on heart, tell you how many people died of cancer today. I couldn't tell you how many people died of flu or how many people died of pneumonia today. I could now make a rough guess, which I wouldn't have been able to a year ago. But the fact is, some sets of statistics are very much in our face still, and others aren't. And we also know, don't we now, that these were very deliberate decisions that were taken by groups like SPY-B and NervTag. And there was talk of quite deliberately needing to ramp up the fear levels to encourage, at the beginning of the pandemic, people to be more afraid in order to get in line and behave and comply with the restrictions that were placed upon them. But I think there's a much broader cultural problem that means the chances are we would not have been in this very same situation. But it's almost as if as a country, we were kind of ripe for something like this to happen. And the thing that perhaps scares me a little bit more even, well, certainly scares me a lot more than COVID, is this way that we have no value, it seems, for freedom, almost as if freedom itself has become a very dirty word, a bad word. So just as we've known for a long time that students on campus talk about free speech as if it's absolutely the equivalent of hate speech, as if free speech only can have bad consequences attached to it, as if it's a very negative and kind of scary value. And my fear is that as a society, we have very much come to see freedom in the same way. I mean, to me, the number one word that freedom's become associated with, and this has become very explicit around the discussion about masks, about personal responsibility, and really come to the fore in the past couple of weeks, is freedom's associated with being selfish. That if I say I think freedom is important, I'm trampling on other people's rights. I'm somehow saying I don't care about vulnerable people. And I think, yes, we can have investigations into what's gone on, and we should have investigations into what's gone on over the past couple of years. We should look at the role that groups like SPY-B have played in quite deliberately spreading fearful messages to society out of all proportion to the real risks that are faced by some groups in society. Obviously, I'm not saying this is obviously a very, very serious virus for particularly elderly people, obviously, as we know, for people with underlying health conditions, but deliberately sending messages to teenagers, for example, that if you hug your granny, you could kill your granny. Mm-hmm. I think messages like that are deeply, deeply irresponsible. And so all kinds of divisions and unhelpful trends in society. But I think we can have those inquiries, and we absolutely should. But I think there's a bigger underlying problem, which is, why has freedom become a dirty word? Why do people seek out security and safety and rate those as values above and beyond freedom? Why have we let this happen in our society?
I know Tim and Tom have got to leave us soon. Tim, let me come back to you, because although I'm skeptical about you becoming world dictator to sort out the shower gel and shampoo problem, I'm extremely in favour of you becoming the chairman of the BBC to actually sort out, proportionate information being given, although I know that's totally contestable. But there's been some interesting stuff in the chat. Peter Gill says average daily death rates in the UK typically between 1,400 and 1,700 from all causes. Somebody asked how many people a day die of suicide. Chris Davies asked. Aidan says apparently it's about 18 a day from suicide. That's very rarely reported, certainly not reported inch by inch. Is the way to get this back the Montgomerie numeracy approach to broadcasting, Tim? And then before you go, I need, after your answer to that question, you to give me your integer number between 0 and 10 for the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood Optimism barometer. That's how optimistic you're feeling about Britain over the next 5 years.
You're still doing that optimism thing.
Yeah. It's going to be pretty grim now. Somebody else said in the chat, what do you think the suicide rate's going to be after this show finishes? So depressed as we've been about everything. But is that the route back to the freedom that Joanna mourns or yearns for? That we've just got to be better at stats in terms of information provision to the public?
The name, I have more and more of these senior moments, but the journalist from the FT who does More or Less on Radio 4, who is it? Tom, you will know.
Tim Harford.
Tim Harford, yeah, exactly.
You correctly picked out the Radio 4 listener, Tim, in asking that question.
But That shouldn't be a ghetto on Radio 4. It shouldn't be one program that's done once a week. It should suffice the whole of BBC output. I listened to a report recently on The World at One where they talked about when Cristiano Ronaldo moved those Coca-Cola bottles away from his press conference, and Radio 4 earnestly reported that the stock market price of Coca-Cola had fallen by, I think, $4 billion. Well, I looked at the data, within about 5 minutes, I realized that was less than the average daily share price movement, that it was actually less than the average share price movement of that day, and it had been completely reversed. Now, that's just one silly example of what supposedly a public service broadcaster presents as a numbers-based story, and actually had nothing of value, nothing of substance to it at all. And I think we need to have a standard whereby we have more journalists like Fraser Nelson, Ed Conway, Todd Whipple, just to boost him again. But there are far too few journalists working for the BBC, working in public life, who care about numbers, who have an understanding about science, who put these general assertions into some sort of statistical framework. And if I was the dictator of the BBC, and I don't know if there's in your power to make it happen, Mark, but I'm certainly available.
I'm on it.
Yeah. That just general, not public service broadcaster. That is supposedly what it is. Educate the public. I think when I was a commentator at the Times, I always wanted, one of the things I looked for in every article was, even if you didn't agree with what the writer had written, tell them something within that article that they didn't know. Leave them better informed at the end of that 900 words than they began. And that's what the BBC's mission should be. It should be to inform and educate and improve the understanding that the public has of the challenges that we face. And I'm afraid a lot of the time, I think the BBC frightens rather than informs. And I'd love to see a Conservative government really take that on. And I can't really see how anyone would object to it. It's just so much something that's needed. To answer your final question, then I'll shut up. I think I'm more and more pessimistic, actually. I can't remember the number that I gave when I was last on Live with Littlewood, but my fundamental problem with this government is that it did really well in the midterm elections that happened in the beginning of May. Mrs. Thatcher would have been embarrassed at those results. Mrs. Thatcher knew that how a parliament worked. You dish out the medicine early on in the parliament. You do tough stuff. You do those tough stuff so that by the time the parliament ends, voters are beginning to see the fruits of what you've done. This government isn't doing anything like that. And you can blame the pandemic if you really want an excuse, but was it clear even before the pandemic struck that this government had a reforming agenda? I don't think so. I don't think it even really knows still what levelling up amounts to. And so I'm afraid I'm pessimistic about this government, because I don't think it's even using Brexit. We've taken quite a hard form of Brexit, but we're not deregulating emerging economic sectors to give ourselves the advantage that we need. So 5, I think I may have given a 6 or a 7 last time, but whatever I gave, it would be 1 or 2 down on what I gave last time.
Yeah, a very modest 5. Or I think you can be optimistic about Manchester United's chances next season.
Not with Ole still at the wheel, I'm afraid, but no.
Tim, great to have you with us. A 5 from Tim Montgomerie. Tom, let me come back to you. I know you've got to leave us as well. I wouldn't want your optimism number to be anyway dented by the fact that Tim Montgomerie is going to force you to work for the BBC, nor indeed that you've got some shelves to put up because your son's destroyed your house. Try and put those out of your mind as you give us your highly market sensitive Live at Littlewood optimism number, Tom.
If I recall, my persistent problem with the optimism scale is that the axis requires I choose a position between two options I don't wish to be at, which is Ayn Rand at 10 and North Korea at 1. So I feel I need an extra axis, and I always put myself in the middle because both options seem equally unpleasant to me. So I am a belligerently not playing your game 5.
So you're not only a 5, you actually want 5 to be the outcome. Yeah. Okay.
This is not ideal for me, but given those options, yes, I suppose I have to be
a 5. Tim, Tom, thanks so much for joining us. Lovely to see you both. Joanna, please stay with us. We've got a whole bunch of other guests now to introduce you to. Delighted to be joined by TalkRadio's Mike Graham. We're going to see what the Republic of Mike Graham think of what's going on at the moment. Also delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Davies from the IEA Home Team. He's our head of education here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And a warm welcome back also to the show to Dominic Frisby, writer, comedian, all-round libertarian polymath. How are you all doing, gentlemen? Oh, look at Mike Graham's backdrop. It's nearly as patriotic as my own. Nearly, Mike. How are you doing, Mike?
Yeah, very well indeed. Apparently, my internet connection is unstable, which is I've often been described as unstable by many people. But so hopefully, it's going to hang in there. And we'll be
yeah. I think it's more about you than your Wi-Fi connection there, Mike. Dominic, how are you doing, sir?
Extremely stable, thank you, Mark.
Extremely stable. And Steve, are you strong and stable? Are you strong and stable, Steve?
I don't know about the strong part, but yeah, certainly stable.
Definitely stable. Listen, we've got a couple of other topics I want to move on to, but let me quickly, Mike, I'll start with you. Just your quick analysis of can July the 19th really be called Freedom Day? It seems that this irreversible direction now seems to have lots of reversibility in it. It's late. I'm losing track of what freedoms I get back next week that I haven't already got. And I can't really see any, if we're not going to end it all now, I'm trying to work out what sort of numbers we would need in order to end restrictions. People coming back to life. I mean, I don't know what we'd actually need.
I mean, I'm starting to call it fake Freedom Day already because it's not really Freedom Day. It depends really where you live. You know, if you live in Manchester, Andy Burnham's going to make sure that you still have to wear a mask if you go on a bus. If you live in London, you're going to have to still wear a mask if you get on the train. I don't understand how this is working because if the government says you no longer need to wear a mask, it's not compulsory anymore. It's not illegal not to wear it. How do they actually make this policy work? And I think I was listening to Tim Montgomerie there. I think this is a government which is characterised by let's see how it goes. I mean, that seems to be what they do. They make an announcement. They see how it goes down. First of all, they sometimes leak it to the Times just to see how everybody likes that. And then suddenly they go, oh, actually, we don't think it's really going all that well. So we won't actually really do that. But what we will do is we'll tell you we're going to do something and we'll see how it goes. And at the moment, that seems to be their main plank of sort of decision making on practically everything, from coronavirus to Brexit to Northern Ireland, you know, to law and order. You know, they're probably now going to extend old Cressida Dick's tenure, despite the fact that the policing of Wembley was one of the worst single episodes of complete blunderism that I've ever seen. And they can't even run a football match, literally. You know, they're about as useless as the final game was played by you know, King Gareth Southgate or Prince Gareth Southgate or Sir Gareth Southgate, whatever he's called. You know, they're fake. They're just fake. They're not doing anything.
Don, what's your take on it? I can always count on Dominic Frisby to leap to the defence of the central state planning, can't I, Dominic?
One of the criticisms I used to levy at Theresa May, who I now think, by the way, should definitely be Prime Minister based on some of the things she's been doing recently. But one of the things I used to levy at her was that she was bereft of any kind of philosophy. And you need what Thatcher used to call first principles. You need some kind of underlying philosophy to what you do, because that helps you make decisions when you're not sure what to do. You've got something to fall back on. And her philosophy seemed to be this sort of centrist, try and keep everyone happy, pander thing. She had no sort of central belief to herself. And you hoped maybe that with Boris, who at least in his Daily Telegraph column used to sort of have a lot of libertarian free market kind of sympathy, and yet as soon as he's got into power, he seems to be guilty of exactly the same things that Theresa May was guilty of. There is no underlying philosophy to what he does, and as a result, it's just a lump of sludge that sort of panders from one focus group to one Twitter follower to one public opinion to another. And oh my goodness, do we need a leadership with some clear ideology at the moment?
Steve, I'm not sure whether you're going to agree or disagree with that. Is the problem that the government doesn't have a kind of moral, ideological, philosophical compass in the way it's making decisions? or have we actually got to a position where the decisions are driven by the science? You know, politics is now mathematical rather than a matter of principle.
Well, it's definitely not that, because I think the government is not doing exactly what I think probably the scientific advice would tell them to, which would be to hold off for a bit. Now, I think that they do have a principle guiding them, though, which is let's see how this plays in the court of public opinion. I mean, that's the problem. I agree completely with what I've just heard. They do not have an underlying vision of what good it is that they're in politics to achieve, other than remaining in office. And so therefore what they do is, as Mike said, they try something out. They float an idea by leaking in the press. They make all kinds of suggestions they're going to do something, and then they wait to see what the public feedback is. And for one thing, the public feedback itself may not accurately, supposedly public feedback, may not accurately reflect what is really going on. But even to the extent that it does, this is not political leadership. It's basically licking your finger and sticking it up in the wind to see which way the wind is blowing. And then suddenly thinking, oh, bugger, I'm going to backtrack on what I said I was going to do a week ago, because turns out a lot of the public don't like it. And as Tim Montgomerie said, political leadership is about making tough decisions that you believe to be the right ones and then paying the political price for them. But it appears that is like completely off the radar in today's politics.
Okay. We've all been a bit depressed about the state of things in Britain, but I want to move on to the world at large. I don't know whether this is going to make us more or less depressed. We're calling this section of the show Beyond Our Shores, exploring a bit how other nations have been handling the pandemic. Definitely at the outset, we were all asked to look at Sweden or what's going on elsewhere. I don't want us to be too introspective, notwithstanding Mike Graham's fantastic backdrop of Night of the Proms and my slightly English patriotic waistcoat. But let's look around at a bit of the rest of the world. I mean, just over the English Channel in France, Macron is, I think, toying with the idea of making vaccination compulsory. As of yesterday, barely half, just over half of French people had received the first vaccine. It's 87% in the UK. Only 42% had received the second jab. It's about 2/3 in the UK. That compares to 70% in rather more liberalised Sweden. Polling in France suggests that only 40% of French people said they would take a vaccine if offered one. Some of them appear to have gone actually beyond that. If you look at Israel, now has no restrictions in place, apart from its recent decree that some mask wearing indoors remains compulsory. Africa's by far the place suffering the worst. South Africa's current cases more than 20% higher than previous peaks. Only 2% of Africans have been vaccinated. Pretty bleak the world over. Joanna, I'm going to start with you by asking which country in the world do you think's handled it the best or the least bad? I'm not going to start with Mike, because the People's Republic of Mike Graham would have sorted this issue out pretty fast. And I'm not going to ask Dominic just yet, because he's going to say his fictional libertarian utopia would have sorted out, Libertaria. But Joanna, surveying the international scene, moving beyond Britain, who's done relatively well? Which countries would you point to say, oh, if only we'd been a bit more like that?
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting, and again, time will tell on this, but I'm convinced that when we can take an overview of the statistics overall, and by that I don't just mean deaths from COVID, but we can actually look at how the economy's performed, how many children have been kept in school. I actually think, there's not going to be that many differences between countries, particularly when we focus on the COVID deaths. And I think one thing that will probably emerge is that no matter what restrictions people have had in place or have not had in place, the really strict lockdown countries, of which Britain is definitely up there and to the fore, also tend to be the ones, obviously not exclusively, there's Australia and New Zealand. Personally, I wouldn't want to have lived there over this past year and a half, wouldn't want to be there now. If I had a choice, I would have been in Sweden for this past 18 months. That's definitely where I would have been. But I think just on some of the other points that you were making towards the end there, Mark, I think one thing that's really interesting, two things actually. One thing is that the countries that have had the most, most coercive now about the vaccine uptake are kind of really twisting people's arms behind their backs, really pushing to make vaccines mandatory, seem to me to be the ones that have got the lowest uptake which should be no big surprise, because the more you have to force people to take the vaccine, you're actually sending out a message that this is not something you'd want to do voluntarily, that there's a problem here, that there's a need to coerce people into taking this. So I think that's one thing that's interesting. The second thing that strikes me as well, just when you read out the statistics, just how amazing we've done in this country actually in getting people vaccinated. And I know that there's nothing new about saying that. This is an old point that's been made before. But what's tragic is that we have absolutely been unable to capitalize on it. We have, like I said, one of the most successful, if not the most successful vaccine rollout program in the world. And yet we're still stuck in this quagmire of will we, won't we, shall we carry on wearing masks? It's almost as if the debate has not kept pace with the vaccine rollout. You know, go back to everything people have been talking about in the first half of this program. It's almost as if that's happened in the absence of this successful vaccine rollout, as if that's just something, a little thing that's happened on the side that's completely irrelevant to the way we're now conducting our lives.
Mike, you're a British broadcaster to a British audience, but as Joanna got a point there, that you could sort of be a bit proud of Britain on getting everybody vaccinated, but I thought the upside of that wasn't just saving lives, it's that we'd get our freedom back faster than anywhere else pretty much on the globe. Have you got anywhere on the planet that you're thinking maybe we should have been a bit more like that, or has everybody screwed this up? Vaccinating people faster might have saved some lives, but it doesn't seem to have, ended the restrictions on our freedom much faster than countries way behind.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole point of the vaccine rollout was to get the economy back to normal, to get the lockdown lifted, and that hasn't still happened. We still can't go anywhere. We still haven't got any tourists coming into the country. People are still going bankrupt every single second of every single day. I think there's only one place that's actually done it right, and that is the state of Florida. Ron DeSantis, the Republican Party governor there, has done a brilliant job where they hardly ever had any lockdown whatsoever. At the beginning, there was spring break back in 2020, and a lot of people came there, became infected. Because I've got the belief that I have about this virus, right, is that nothing that we have done has changed anything. It's just done whatever it's done. And it's infected the north of England when it wanted to. It's infected the south of England. It's moved across to France. We've had variants coming from places like Peru, from places like India. It's basically a virus that moves around the world. And the Florida had it no worse than anybody else and no better than anybody else. But what they didn't do is completely destroy their economy. And now the economy in Florida is booming. People are having a great time. People have been going to baseball games. They've been going to football games. They've been doing everything that they would normally do. And they haven't had any more casualties than we have.
Steve, what's your take? I should say that Christian Niemitz, my colleague here at the IEA, released a great research paper a while back called Viral Myths, basically saying it's too early to learn lessons, and there's a risk in people saying, this proves my philosophy all along. But on what we have seen in Steve, do you think that we can point to some early, indications of who got it right, who got it wrong? Might Joanna be right that actually sort of, if you like, lockdowns may have had a more trivial effect than we would have thought?
Well, I think I would say that Taiwan is the sort of top country in terms of having got this right, partly because they had the advantage of being near to the center of the original outbreak. They were able to take immediate action, pretty effective action, and thereafter get away without lockdowns or the kind of economy damaging measures that were imposed elsewhere. And it's true, the virus, once it's got loose, once it's out there, it's very, very hard to stop. And the thing is that it's going to have a bigger impact in some parts of the world than in others, not because of the policy so much as because of things like the way the healthcare system works in different parts of the world, the way the economy is organized, the amount of travel that there is, all kinds of stuff like that. And governments have then been trying to play a catch-up game of trying to respond to the kind of constantly shifting challenge that the virus poses. And as time goes on, parts of the world that you think had been doing pretty well have suddenly, it turns out, not been doing well. Like Japan, for example, which looked as though it was doing really well. Now they were seriously thinking even last week that they were going to cancel the Olympic Games after all, because they're having such a massive outbreak in central Japan. So the virus is constantly mutating, constantly shifting its targets, and it's just very, very hard to do. The thing is, doing nothing, I think, is not an option. But the problem is people have to really make it up as they go along. And so there's undoubtedly going to be a lot of mistakes made. That's unavoidable, I think. And I do agree with Christian. I think it's a bit early yet to say what the right strategies are. We can pick certain very clear, like, gold star countries, if you will. I think Israel is one. Taiwan is another one. South Korea, until very recently, seemed to be another one of those. Maybe Australia and New Zealand, but not very many. For everybody else, it's like done well at some times, done badly at other times, done well in some respects, done badly in other respects, basically.
Dominic, what about you? Have you got a favourite country? I mean, we know in the football that, England did quite well, but we know, you're not going to pick Italy, are you, as your favourite country? Please don't pick that. That's banned from discussion. But have you got any indication of across the globe, who's done particularly well?
Well, I am quarter Italian, Mark, so I was hedged in the final the other day quite nicely.
I was hedged in the final because I put £1,000 on Italy to win, just to assuage my disappointment if England fluffed it. So
it's always
I knew
a good
I was
tactic.
going to leave the match either happier or richer, but not both.
It's always a good tactic to bet on the outcome you don't want. I'm afraid, Mark, I haven't really studied the different policies of different countries around the world. I can only regurgitate what I see on Twitter, and that's my own little bubble. But it looks to me like Texas and Florida are the two places that seem to have handled it better than anywhere. But what I will say is, tell me which country has taken the least authoritarian, most voluntarist approach to COVID, and that for me will be the country that's handled it best.
It seems to me that you've slightly decided your conclusion before sifting
Absolutely.
through all of the empirical evidence.
I will. I'm
going
to go back and find the evidence to suit my conclusion, just as everyone else does.
I can see in the chat, Chris Davies says, Matt Hancock said once the over 70s were vaccinated, we would cry freedom.
Yeah.
That's hardly happened, has it? It's
we know he wasn't really concentrating on the job, though, was he?
No, that seems to be the case as well. Yeah, he's crying. He's crying now. I'm not sure he was crying freedom. Joanna, I know I've got to let you go. What's your how depressed or optimistic are you for the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood optimism barometer over the next 5 years? If you think the next 5 weeks are going to be bad, but we'll bounce back, that's almost a rounding error. But over the next 5 years, or as you were saying earlier, is freedom in retreat, perhaps permanently?
Yeah, I mean, that's my real worry, that freedom is in retreat. But then, I want to be optimistic. I really, really want to be optimistic. And I think, I suffered as much as everybody else here on Sunday evening watching the football. But actually, one thing that cheered me up was definitely not Italy winning, but the sight of all the people in the crowds not wearing masks, everybody happy, everybody celebrating. And my real hope is that once people get a little bit of a taste, once they dip their toe in the water again, get a little bit of taste of going out, enjoying themselves, seeing their friends, mixing, you can't put the genie back in the bottle easily. And, before it happens, people are going to say and tell posters, because they know it's the right thing to say, that, oh, yeah, we want masks, we want curfews, we want to be locked down forever. But actually give people a bit of a taste of fun and freedom again. And I'm really hoping people will go for it, that there's something in human nature. We're social beings. We want to be out there. We want to be mixing with other people. Now, this might be a little bit more of a long-term project. Maybe this is more of a 5 to 10 year project that my optimism is going to be extending to this happening. But like I say, who knows? I think there were great scenes at the football. It certainly made me very happy to see other people so happy and mixing in such large numbers, and not all kind of standing there in Wembley, socially distanced and mask wearing and silent, but actually just really letting rip and enjoying themselves. And I think we all need to take a leaf out of their book.
Sounds like you're going to give me a high number out of 10. What is it?
Do you know what? I think I'll go 6. And that might not sound high to other people, but as you know, Mark, for me, that is an absolute miracle.
Yeah, it's going to be hard for me to give such a high number, Joanna. I was at Wembley on Sunday, and I can report on the upside. I don't think I saw anybody wearing a mask. There was some, I think, preposterous suggestion that you're not supposed to sing at football matches. I mean, that went out of the window as well. So when it was actually when you actually got to the nitty gritty, it was rather different. People were asking me what it was like at Wembley, and I was like, well, you watched the match on television, you can imagine what it was like. It had its highs and lows over 120 minutes. It was a pretty agonising experience. I knew I was in trouble when my Fitbit pinged. I thought, what the hell's going on here? I looked at it, and it said your heart rate has now exceeded 150 beats per minute, and all I was doing was standing up. Joanna, lovely to have you with us. See you again soon, I hope. Keep the torch of freedom flying high. I want to finish by putting this ghastly pandemic and lockdowns and everything in a bit of an historical context. Despite how the last 18 months has felt to many of us, and despite the number of people who've lost their lives, COVID has not been the end of the world. But what's coming next? So I want to end with a section we're calling Apocalypse Next, and asking what are the new threats that are lurking around the corner. Clearly, the last year or so will be seen as an odd, rather depressing, grim period in history. But sometimes I think that we talk too much about history is being made. History is always being made. Apparently history would have been made if England had actually won the penalty shootout. I'm not sure how historical that is, but what might be coming next? Because it strikes me that crises seem to be sort of more and more regular. I'm thinking across most of my adult life, we had 9/11, we've had the banking crisis, Brexit was supposed to end the world. Now we've had COVID-19. What's the next big thing around the corner? Or can't we predict it actually? And we just need to build a resilient society in order to try and cope with whatever's next, rather than fighting the last war, when the next threat might not be a pandemic, it might be, I don't know, cybersecurity or something. Steve, you've written about this. Yes. You wrote a paper called Going Viral, that you argue that, I'm quoting you here, some aspects of how we live are simply too dangerous. And with regard to pandemics, they make the next one quite likely. What are you most concerned about? Another pandemic if we don't change behavior, or something completely else, or can we just not know?
Well, no, I mean, two things. One, first of all, you mentioned how there seems to be more and more crises, but actually that's just a historical illusion. There are crises of that kind constantly throughout history. There's never been a period when the world wasn't pretty interesting in that regard. The thing is that this pandemic has been a really bad experience, but it's not been by any means the worst thing that could have happened. And there is a small category of very low probability, but extremely bad events that could happen. And it is worth being a bit concerned about them. Not that you want to change the way you live, but you need to get yourself prepared to be a bit more resilient just in case they happen. In the same way that you have to take certain actions, certainly to prevent your house being burned down, you take out insurance to rebuild it from the ground up if that worst should happen. That's a very low probability event, but you'd be a fool not to have that insurance, because if it were to happen, you'd be ruined. Now, I think that, yes, there are a number of risks like that, and pandemics are one of them. One of the problems is that this is not a 100-year event anymore. We've managed to do various things that have turned it into a once in a 20-year event, roughly, a 5% in any 1 year probability. Things like modern intensive farming, and particularly the overuse of antibiotics on livestock. I mean, we've got off lightly this time. The real nightmare would be a bacterial pandemic with a bacterium that was immune to antibiotics. That would be an absolute disaster. But there are some others. I mean, one of them, for example, which Oliver Letwin has sort of discussed in a book he published recently called Apocalypse How, is that we have in many ways a society that's too complicated. Everything depends upon very complicated institutional arrangements, and it all depends upon a small number of key systems, the internet, online payment systems, things of that sort. And we've allowed all the alternatives to atrophy. And so if you had something like a cyber attack now, which happened to successfully undermine this global network, it would make everything fall apart, and you'd have an absolute disaster before you got things put back together again. So there are certain kind of things where you do need to be a bit concerned about the risk that you're running. And what you should do is stop doing things that make these low probability events more likely, and also work out ways of making society more resilient, more adaptable, more, actually, to use Nassim Nicholas Taleb's expression, anti-fragile. In other words, something that will actually thrive on disorder. Now, the market economy is an example of that. Because sure, we've had disastrous effects from the pandemic, but we've had companies like, HelloFresh and Zoom, for whom it's been a godsend, because suddenly these new ways of doing business have sprung up. And that shows you how an unregulated market is actually, in Taleb's terminology, anti-fragile. It actually grows and thrives on the disruptions of settled ways of doing things. And you need to have more of that. Whereas at the moment, I think the problem is we have a lot of very rigid systems in place which can't cope with sudden unexpected shocks.
I'm going to come to Dominic in a minute. I can see in the chat, Peter Gill asked, was I in Wembley, were you near Tom Cruise and David Baddiel, Mark? And I was going to say, no, I was in the cheap seats, but then I remembered that my seat actually cost me 550 quid. That's what passes for a cheap seat at Wembley these days. And I suspect when I come to Dominic, we might come on to inflation as the next threat. But Mike, let me come to you. Look, you're a broadcaster, you're a commentator. I'm asking you to be a bit of a forecaster, which is unfair. But what could be coming next? And has Steve got a point that what we actually need to do is not try and predict what's coming next. We just need to build a bit of a more resilient rather than snowflakey society and then deal with what hits us.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Steve said makes a lot of sense, but I would go one step further and actually say we actually are quite resilient because we've actually come through this by and large. I mean, I think we're certainly coming out of it. It would seem to me anyway, that we're no longer walking around like we were in sort of April of 2020 thinking, am I going to drop dead in the street? Am I going to see somebody dropping dead in the street? That never actually happened. And all of the things that happened and have happened in my lifetime, we have kind of got through and we've adapted. I mean, I was watching In the Name of the Father the other night because it's back on Netflix, you know, the movie about the Guildford Four. And, you know, I suddenly thought, my God, the 70s was a dreadful decade. You guys are probably too young to remember it. But, you know, I lived through the 70s and Mike, it was like living in the dark ages. I mean, literally, you know, the biggest shop that we had to go and buy food in was about the size of a Tesco Metro on Finchley Road. And it was a Sainsbury's, you know, and everything was in a tin. And, you know, Vesta rice was the thing that you ate for dinner. And that was considered to be quite exotic. And when you think now that how far we've come and how unbelievably modern the world has become, you know, I think an awful lot more people than we think are very resilient. I mean, the snowflake generation, who are the people that write newspaper columns and the people that go on the radio, not on TalkRadio, obviously, but the people that tell you that everything's going to change, that nobody wants to work in an office anymore, that's all rubbish. You know, people driving vans, people that look at Deliveroo, wasn't really a business to speak of before the last year. Now you've got people on bikes, you've got people on, you know, sort of rickshaws, you've got people doing all sorts of things for themselves, making money. The economy has not crashed. There's a pretty good chance it will recover massively. Yes, there are things that we haven't been able to do, but I think we'll come out of this in the same way that we came out. You know, after 9/11, everyone thought we're never going to fly anywhere ever again. After the Bataclan, we thought we'd be walking into Islamic people with machine guns around every corner, killing people. You know, we are incredibly resilient as the human race and as a nation, I think. And I think we just move on and we forget about it.
But Mike, do you think the problem might be that, you know, your listeners and the great Joe public are pretty resilient folks? The problem isn't just that, you know, snowflake journalists necessarily. Is it a snowflake political class? Yes. I mean, you know, one public health measure the government's taking in all of these times is to ban advertisements for jam, for crying out loud. So terrible are things. I mean, is that the problem?
We did a story today about the BMW ad that's been banned because it shows a BMW M car revving. And apparently that's considered to be, you know, reckless because you don't want to encourage people to drive at high speed in a car. You know, I mean, it'd be great. If you don't want to buy a BMW, don't buy one. It's not my choice. I wouldn't want one. But, you know, we don't need to be protected from everything by this sort of class of like the Chris Whitties of this world, a man who looks as though he's never taken a chance in his life. You know, I just think that we need to get back to being proper human beings where we mingle with one another, we talk to one another, we learn from one another, and we move on.
Dominic, what's the next big threat? Are you able to stare into your crystal ball?
Yes, I am. And I can tell you exactly what it's going to be and when it's going to happen. But before I do that, let me just say, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. It's really interesting looking at how different bodies around the country reacted and to the coronavirus, to the crisis. And you see, for example, there was a week when, you know, there was no loo paper, the supermarket shelves were empty, and things looked really dicey. But the free market, all the supply chain issues, all the fragility, it sorted itself out so quickly. And it was fantastic to see. And yet you look at all the big government bodies, the NHS and the education system, they still haven't sorted themselves out. And so you see a real difference between the market economy when people are acting in their own self-interest and blah, 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 and the state run the planned economy. And going forward, what are we optimistic about? What are we negative about? I'm really worried that we're sort of entering this new kind of I won't use the word tyranny. It's not a tyranny, but this new kind of rulership, this loss of freedom, where the overarching system of rule isn't some malevolent dictator, it's health and safety. And we seem to be in this, there are two types of people. There's one person who goes, go on, I'll just go out and do it and we'll work it out and we'll see what happens and we'll sort it out. And that's the sort of entrepreneurial inventor, explorer kind of mentality. And then there's this other, you never know what might happen. And in a healthy society, you probably need a bit of both because they keep the two in check. But we just seem to have, and this isn't just a UK problem, it's an almost global problem of mission creep and government overreach, where every aspect of the economy needs some kind of intervention and some state planner to come and sort out a situation that the market can sort out perfectly well for itself without intervention. Intervention, in my view, almost makes things worse. I would also agree that life has been getting steadily better and we only notice, but because improvement is incremental, you don't notice it, you only notice the bad stuff. So, the news only highlights the bad things that go wrong. It doesn't report on the good stuff because nobody cares about that. And then you switch on the news and you think the world's about to end. So these intermittent crises we've had, what they ignore is the fact that on the sort of graph of life, things have been getting steadily better. So that's something to be positive about. As for predicting where the next crisis is, in 2000, you wouldn't have known that, in 3 days' time, the Twin Towers are going to get bombed. In 2006, you wouldn't know that there was this huge crisis brewing in subprime lending and so on and so forth. So crises are impossible to predict. But I do know this, there is only so much debasement of money that you can do before things get very messy. And we have seen the systematic debasement of currency for 20, 30 years now. And it's just getting more and more liberties are being taken. And you just see now, everyone's going, surprise inflation, it's 3 or 4%. Meanwhile, house prices are up 13% this year. And you're telling me there's no inflation. But house prices aren't in official measures of inflation, so they don't count as inflation. Well, it's very real inflation to any person who wants to buy a house. And basically the intergenerational gap just went up by 13%. And it's that intergenerational divide, something's going to go very badly wrong there. And if the government intervenes to sort it out, it is going to get worse. And somehow, we need an ideologically sound prime minister who believes in free markets and individual responsibility and choice and all the rest of it, to just go, do you know what? We're going to actually go for less government, not more. But my concern at the moment is just this growth of government in every aspect of our lives. And the more things that government is responsible for, the less things that the market can sort out. And so that is my biggest fear. And it's a global mission creep of health and safety.
But if inflation hits, right, it might be that in 5 years' time, it's no longer compulsory to wear a face mask in a supermarket, but it's compulsory to bring your own wheelbarrow in order to push around your completely valueless £20 notes.
I'm afraid, Mark, there is a proven historical link between the size of government reach and inflation. And the smaller the government, the sounder the money tends to be, and the bigger the government, the less value the money has. And so this printing of money, this government reach, this mission creep, it's all part of the same thing. And I'm really worried about, because if we get proper inflation, things will get nasty.
Yeah, true enough as a threat. Steve, your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree completely with Dominic that this is the big threat. I mean, at the moment, here in the UK, they're saying, inflation isn't going to go above 2%. Oh, wait a minute, it just did. Well, wait a minute, that means it's going to go back down pretty soon. In the United States, they just had another inflation figure came out yesterday, 5.1%. It's accelerating, in fact.
And that doesn't include houses. Steve.
Indeed, absolutely. And a whole bunch of other stuff. And as Dominic says, you can only go on expanding the money supply, printing funny money for so long. And I would quote, to reassure him, though, I would think of Herbert Stein's famous dictum, if something cannot go on forever, it won't. The problem is you can't tell when it will stop, but you can be pretty sure it will. But the stopping is going to be pretty interesting, shall we say, and rather unpleasant. And if I could just add in, the other thing that's going on here is that, has been clear all through this evening, there's a big problem with risk and people's evaluation of risk. And Tim Montgomerie was waxing very eloquent about how innumerate most of the journalist class are, and they don't understand elementary risk and probability mathematics. But I think also the problem is something Joanna highlighted, which is that there's a large minority of the British public who appear to have the idea that the world should be one in which there is no risk of anything bad ever happening to anyone, which is a complete impossibility, of course. And if you try to behave in that way, not only are you going to be panicked when something bad does happen, but also you're going to be the kind of person who thinks that we should, shut down nightclubs forever and, have a curfew and do everything like that, because there might just be some incredible minuscule risk. And of course, the reality, as Mike was saying, is that, people do take risks all the time. That said, there is a small number of really extreme risks, where low probability but extreme risks, where it does pay to take precautions and do things to be sure that you're not going to be completely destroyed by them. But that's not the same as panicking and worrying about risks where you can make reasonable trade-offs between taking a risk and benefiting and paying the cost if you lose it. And that's the problem. We have about 20 to 30% of the population in most countries, it would seem, who basically think that they want to live in a completely risk-free world. I mean, I honestly don't know where this came from.
There's this expectation that any kind of loss be socialised.
I agree completely, yeah.
Mike, you were saying earlier that I can just about remember the 70s. I was born in 1972, so I've got a few memories, and you were quite right about how grim it was. I mean, I can remember my parents just about being able to buy a second television set, but it was black and white and crap. And there were only 3 channels on it and all of the rest. But do you think we might be going back to the 1970s in terms of government screwing up the economy and inflation?
The only thing that was better, to be fair, in the 70s was the BBC. It was actually quite good then. Now it's
comedy was better.
But I tell my kids now, I said, do you know that there was one particular year when I was at school where we had no electricity? And I used to go to school one day a week for the morning only, and we played football in the afternoon, because there was a power cut every day. And you had an hour of electricity in the morning to have breakfast, which was always sausages. And then in the evening, you had an hour for dinner. And the rest of the time, we used to sit around in candlelight. I used to nick candles from the local church so that we wouldn't run out of candles. I mean, that's what it was like for an entire term, a school term. And they're looking at me like, he's making this up now. I'm like, I'm not making it up. That's what it was like. I don't think we're going back there. I think it's very interesting what Dominic said. And I agree with Steve as well, that there are people now that want us to do away with risk. They just don't want there to be anything. It's the same people that have invented this climate emergency. It's not an emergency, for one thing. And the idea that we're supposed to buy our way out of it by building more solar panels and driving more electric cars and having, a new boiler that's not powered by gas, and somehow that's going to save the world. It's complete, I'm sorry to say this, and utter bollocks. We are going to repair the economy. I'll take both Dominic and Steve's point about money and currency and inflation, because also one of the things that we had was negative equity back in the 70s and early 80s, where people suddenly had a mortgage that was worth more than their house was worth. And, once you start getting to that point, the dream of home ownership won't suddenly be such a dream. It'll be more of a nightmare. So I think some things will change, some businesses will disappear, new businesses will emerge. And that's called evolution, as far as I know. That's civilization, isn't it?
And do you think that, where do we need to put our faith, Mike? Is it in, your trusty listeners, that actually the kind of British spirit will see us through, and even the politicians will continue to screw things up and look for problems? I mean, it was Marx who said, Groucho Marx, not Karl Marx, that politics is the art of looking for problems, finding them everywhere, misdiagnosing them, and applying the wrong solutions. I mean, we just need to get used to that and make sure that we, the great British public, go about our merry way as best we're able.
We like to pride ourselves on the phrase common sense, which an awful lot of people have got. There's a very small supply of it in Westminster, it seems to me, very short supply of it in Cabinet, and even less in number 10. So I think we can put our trust in the British people, who have always, for a very long time, and I think Brexit is to blame for this. I don't remember a time when we were so divided and so believing in prime ministers and in leaders of political parties as if they've got the answer. They haven't got the answer. In fact, you shouldn't put your trust in any politician. I'm not particularly party political, but I've never expected any politician to lead me out of the wilderness into the nirvana of the future. You know, they're there to do a job. I give them some money. They usually misuse it. They spend it on the wrong things. They've usually got their hands on somebody else's wife. And quite frankly, you know, I think the rest of us just have to get on with it.
And so, Mike, with that, what's your Live with Littlewood optimism rating between 0 and 10 for the next 5
Well,
years?
I'm going to go high because, you know, I'm a great optimist and I do believe in the goodness and the common sense of the British public. I'm going to go 7.
7, high so far. Thanks, sir. Thanks so much. Dominic, what about you? I can never quite work out whether you're an optimist, a pessimist, or a realist. Where are you at?
Nor can I, and it often depends which way the wind is blowing, Mark. But at the moment, I'm going to go 5, middle of the road, because on the one hand, there's all these wonderful things going on, technology and all these wonderful forces improving our lives. But I'm really concerned about this mission creep and this lack of freedom. And, you know, this summer's a total... Last summer was better than this summer. Nobody can go anywhere this summer. Nobody knows what they're doing. And it's just such a mess. And we need to get freedom of movement back.
Steve, I'll finish with you. What's your number on the Live with Littlewood Optimism Index, you know, for freedom over the next 5 years?
Yeah, over the next 5 years, yeah. Actually, I'm going to give the one I always give, which is 6, because I think actually that kind of thing is not really affected that much by what's going on in the short term. And actually, I think that, you know, a crisis, if I thought there was going to be a major crisis in the next 5 years, and I suspect there probably is actually, that would actually make me more optimistic in a way, because it will mean a crisis in the system that Mike and Dominic have been, you know, decrying. It will have hit the buffers, which can, you know, only have good effects in some regards, I think.
Well, yeah, I would agree, assuming that we don't replace it with something worse.
That is true. That's the Yorkshire view. I know. That's the kind of Yorkshire view. Never say you're at the bottom. It could always get worse. You know?
Well, as the first Director General of the IEA used to say in the 1970s, which we've referred to quite a bit, when he was asked, you know, what the heck are we going to do? You know, the unions are destroying everything. The government commands vast swathes of the economy. Inflation's a problem. Everybody's going bust. Everything's grim. And he said, cheer up. Things can only get worse.
Yes, yeah.
And they did get worse for a little bit, but then it got to an inflection point and things got better. So I'm going to give a middle of the road 5 as well, which I think actually brings out, oh God, I've now got a highly complicated maths thing to do. 16, 23, 28, 30, 39. What is 39 divided by 7?
Doesn't.
6 7s are 42. So it's sort of, it's 5.5.
5.5.
6.5.
Yeah, you are a pessimist.
5. Well, but that's
so it's 6.5.
Yeah.
6 7s are 42.
It's exactly
so,
6.5, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's exactly 6.5. But my number is a bit low because I fear that Southampton are going to get relegated next season, and that's very much a first world problem. That's very much a first world problem. Yeah. So
Southampton, that's a third world.
So that's Portsmouth. If all we need, I want to get back to worrying about what Tim was saying earlier about share gel and shampoo, and me worrying about whether Saints are going to end up in the bottom 3. If we can get back to that, then some sort of normality would have returned. Mike, Dominic, Steve, lovely to see you as ever. Thanks so much for your common sense and your sort of mild optimism, I guess, your sort of middle of the road optimism, but your outspoken, brilliant pro-freedom views. Absolute pleasure to see you all. Thanks so much. Thanks all of you for watching. Please hit the thumbs up if you've enjoyed the show. Also, if you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you've got a few pennies spare, because it is, after all, 2021 and not the 1970s, so we've got lots of pennies to spare, we're supposed to have. And as Dominic and others have pointed out, you know, with inflation, those pennies aren't worth much anymore. So you can throw them in my direction. You can go to patreon.com and become an IEA online patron. My thanks to some of those who have signed up at the top level to help us broadcasting. Timothy Worrell, Nick Heath, James Burns, Eric Keane, Richard Leader, Mark Edwards. Many others of you have also contributed to keeping us on air. Thanks very much. That's the final show of this series of Live with Littlewood. We'll be back in the autumn, or when freedom comes back, whichever is earlier. But don't worry, over the coming weeks, there'll be a lot more content about freedom and free markets on the IEA London YouTube channel. So please subscribe, donate if you can. Thanks again to my guests. Thanks again to my audience. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.
There you go.